All right. My name is Corinne, or you can call me Karina. So as you may notice, my accent, even though I'm in New Zealand, I'm not a New Zealander originally. I am now, it's my adopted country, but I'm originally from the States. I'm Ukrainian American. And the story of how I got connected with the communities I work with in New Zealand is quite long and for another time, but I'd be happy to talk about it at any point in time. So thank you for the invitation, Diakuyu, to the organizers and also to all of you who are here now. I'm really I've been looking forward to this, especially when I saw the topics and how much they were complementing each other. And also the activities throughout the week are just fantastic. So well done, everyone. All right, so I'm going to jump into this. I'm going to talk about multimodal translanguaging and the linguistic landscape. So similar to talks, the first two talks, there will be elements that come into that. But where I'm going to push it is by focusing a little bit more on how these can then be applied to supporting language reclamation and maintenance work. All right, so first, before starting, I do want to acknowledge, it's tradition in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to first of all acknowledge the people of the land where we are. And I know that we're in a cyberspace land right now, but there are indigenous communities in all of the lands where we are currently standing. And so I would like to acknowledge those communities. And also during my acknowledgements, I'd like to acknowledge my associate investigators on my research in this area, Dr. Vincent Olson Reeder from Te Kawa Maui at Victoria University of Wellington, and Dr. Honiara Salanoa at National University of Samoa. Also, you can see on the right my list of current research assistants on this project, and I'd like to acknowledge all of them as well. All right, so this research that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to do theory first, but before getting into theory, I'd like to introduce you a little bit to what all of this is. So my research team, we call ourselves Translanguaging Aotearoa, also the Wellington Translanguaging Project. Aotearoa is the native name, the indigenous name for New Zealand, and Translanguaging Aotearoa, we are a research group where we do research with Maori and Pacifica communities alongside them. And we draw upon translanguaging and linguistic landscapes and some other theories as well, indigenous theories as well, to try to support work in language maintenance and reclamation, especially for young children in schools. So the research team is multifaceted, and when I draw upon the data that we have and talk about that and some of our findings and what we do and things like that, I'll be referring to the Wellington Translanguaging Project and our resource branch that we put out our resources called Translanguaging Aotearoa. Now, what I'm talking about is this group of people. So there's two projects that are connected, and they run simultaneously, they run in parallel. There's overlap, but there's also dedication to the communities they work with. So the AI on the Pacifica side is Honiara, the AI on the Maori side is Vinny, and then you can see we've got research assistants for each side. And we also work with the teachers and community members, elders, students, families, so on and so forth. So we started in 2016. That's when I got the first grant to establish the Wellington Translanguaging Project. Currently, we have national government funding to continue until the end of 2023, and we'll see. We'll see what sort of magic doors can hopefully open at that point to continue this. And so far, we have over 600 hours of recorded data because we do use the ethnographic approach. So that's just the recorded data. We've been working alongside the communities since 2016. So there's all the experiential data as well as the research assistants and the AIs, their lived experiences as members of these communities as well. All right, so that's us. Some of this is going to be revisited, but I'm going to draw upon ideas from the previous two presenters. So when Josh was talking about the Scentscapes, that's the type of linguistic landscape that we draw upon. So we're not talking about the traditional type of linguistic landscape. We are talking about pushing it further, going into the Scentscapes, going into the inclusion of not just traditional texts, but all spoken messages, visual images, moving images, flags, clothing, tattoos, graffiti, sounds, smells, all of this. So when I use linguistic landscapes in this research for this project, that's what we're talking about. And we're looking at, because it's in a pedagogical space, and because we're looking at applications for supporting maintenance and reclamation work, we're talking about the aspect of that that's systematically produced, purposeful, and meaningful. So the school environment has been identified as a key area for linguistic landscapes research. That's where you get the idea of schoolscapes, right? And part of this is because it can help us understand more critically about what's going on in the ecology of the learning environment. And the part of that understanding includes seeing how the schoolscapes impact on students' investment in the classroom. And that's not just a negative impact, that's also a positive impact. So how can we support and increase investment in language learning? So not just in the classroom, but a lot of the work has been done in the classroom, and I acknowledge that. So the linguistic landscape also helps us understand how translanguaging operates in the learning environment. And there's been quite a bit of research done in this area as well, and that's really where I'm going to dig down into further in this presentation. And why are we interested in this at all? Well, as Sylvia mentioned and Anna mentioned in the beginning, we know that it's really important that students feel supported in education, because when they feel supported, when they feel seen, when they feel heard, they're more invested in that educational space. And we know this from heaps of heritage language research that's gone on over the last couple decades. We also know that people express their identity through language. So if you only have access to a particular part of your linguistic repertoire, you're only going to be able to express a piece of your identity. Whereas if you're in a pedagogical environment where you're allowed to draw upon your full linguistic repertoire, you're going to be able to express much more of your identity and your experience. So because of that, it's really important for people to have access to all of their linguistic repertoire in order to fully communicate their ideas and feelings, including in the classroom, a space that's supposed to be exploratory, experiential, creative, that's filled with growth. You need access to your full linguistic repertoire to be able to access all of your ideas and thoughts and feelings. So that's where translanguaging comes in, right? So having access to your full linguistic repertoire. And as Josh introduced as well with translanguaging, Garcia and Way talked to us about this is the deployment of a speaker's full linguistic repertoire without paying attention to the socially and politically defined boundaries of named languages. And this is something that has been debated quite a lot, as you can imagine, in a context like Aotearoa, New Zealand, where there is such a wonderfully strong Indigenous language community in the Te Reo Māori speakers. And part of the reason that community is so strong is because of all of the work that has gone into immersion education and creating these protected language nests. So part of what inspired this work for my colleagues and I was the challenge, is this idea going to damage the work that's been done in language reclamation thus far? And so we thought that's a very worthy question, and that's something that's really, really important to consider. And so we said, before we jump on the translanguaging train, because it sounded great to us, translanguaging sounded fantastic. We said, but before we do that, we need to do our due diligence and find out what that would mean for these communities. So that's really what has inspired the work of the Wellington Translanguaging Project in our resource branch, Translanguaging Aotearoa. So Josh was also talking about translanguaging as pedagogy, and in the meta review of literature that my colleagues and I have done, we've also found that there's a trend that the literature is focused in one of three ways, or on multiple within these three. So translanguaging it's been talked about a lot of different ways, written about a lot of different ways. But in general, people are either talking about it as a pedagogy, as practice, or as theory. And pedagogy is teaching, right? So how it's used in teaching, how it's employed for that purpose. Practice is what people do, like the actual actions they do. And that's where a lot of this conversation has overlapped with code switching, where people talk about how is this similar or different to code switching. Well, when you're looking at the practice of it, the actual actions people are looking at might be the same, but the lens they're putting on, the theoretical lens or the pedagogical lens, will be different. And the purpose of that will be different. But it's important to recognize that still that these conversations people are having, and where some people are getting stuck on what exactly is translanguaging, how is this different from code switching, so on and so forth, has to do with how they're viewing it, because it can be viewed as a pedagogy, as practice, or as theory, or a mixture of those. So the Wellington Translanguaging Project and Translanguaging Aotearoa, we sit at this crossover in the middle, because what we're doing is we're saying we are looking at the paradigm shift in the theory of how language is viewed, and following along with the importance of looking at the full linguistic repertoire and the theory behind that. But we're also interested in doing that by looking at practice of what people are actually doing every day with language before we intervene at all. What are they doing? And what's working for them in the goals they want to achieve? And then pedagogy as well, because then that's when we say, okay, based on the theory, based on the practice, based on what you want to also achieve, here are pedagogical interventions that we can suggest and help you with. So we are sitting at the center of all three. And translanguaging as pedagogy are those ways in which multilingual students and teachers engage in complex and fluid discursive practices. And this includes home language practices, as well as anything else that they need to communicate or to make sense of things around them, any subject knowledge, any academic languages, anything in that linguistic repertoire. So like I said, then there's this question of, okay, great. So we've established translanguaging is important and useful for language learning. It's important and useful for student investment in the classroom. But when we look specifically at Indigenous languages, which are a special classed category of languages and need special protections, how does translanguaging affect language reclamation work? Right? And like I mentioned, these are valid concerns from stakeholders because they have fought hard in order to get these protected spaces, in order to promote the use of the languages and to keep them alive, or for lots of Indigenous languages to bring them back from the brink, right? So it's really, they're valid concerns. And we want to make sure that we are ensuring that any translanguaging pedagogical practices are helpful for these communities, not harmful. You may notice also that I've been talking about language reclamation instead of language revitalization. And that's actually a recent development that my team and I have picked up. So for instance, we have a paper that we published in System in 2020 last year that talks about translanguaging and language revitalization. Well, that's because that was submitted and accepted before this white paper came out that was really brilliantly written by these Indigenous scholars, Hannah Ochoa, Elliot Groves, Meek, and Rogoff, in the Modern Language Journal. And in this white paper, they talked about the importance of shifting the conversation from language revitalization to language reclamation. And part of that is because it is breaking with the settler colonial narrative of language death. So the settler colonial communities and individuals are the ones from where this discourse of language death has come from. However, Indigenous communities say, we didn't do this. This is a result of what you've done to us. So instead, we're trying to revitalize by reclaiming. So we need to do away with the discourse of language death because it's not helping us. And so that's the first step. And then also it acknowledges that language learning needs to be for the purpose of contributing to the community and to family in real life, because that's also a very core facet of Indigenous language communities and keeping those communities alive. Also, the idea of correcting language to a set standard is also settler colonial. And it comes from these northern discourses, these global north discourses of how you should learn and speak a language. However, that's not what was traditionally done in Indigenous communities. Instead, all contributions were valued. And so reframing what's going on as well to look more at contributions in the language classroom as being valuable and not something that needs to be corrected to a set standard, that's also quite core to reframing this under an Indigenous perspective and aligning with Indigenous values. And interestingly, also happens to align with translanguaging as well. And the authors call out translanguaging and say, this aligns with these ideals. This is a good direction for us to be heading in. So these are some key points that we keep in mind in the work we do. And this has aligned with work done by Jason Senos and Dirk Gorder on sustainable translanguaging, where they said that in order to keep translanguaging sustainable for communities, particularly for minority communities, there need to be 5 key things that you meet, 5 key goals. One is you need to design functional breathing spaces for using the minority languages. So again, protected spaces. In Aotearoa, this looks like things like mat time at the language nest, where everyone comes to the mat and sings and plays and talks and reads stories in the Indigenous language. The second one is developing the need to use the minority languages through translanguaging. And this would be something, Jason Senos has given talks where she's talked about having story completion tasks where you're prompted to complete the story in the minority language, or where in order to understand the full story, you need to have a better grasp or start learning more of the minority language. Otherwise, you only get part of the story, and things like that. So creating materials or activities that require an increasing amount of knowledge in the minority language so that you can get an increasingly strong grasp on the activity that's happening. So you can understand more, you can complete more. Also using emergent multilinguals resources to reinforce all languages by developing meta-linguistic awareness. So talking about language and talking about what's going on with the languages as well, and using all of the full linguistic repertoire to talk about languages. So languaging about languaging, right? And enhancing language awareness as well. So again, that a lot of that can be done through these meta-linguistic discussions. And then linking spontaneous translanguaging to pedagogical activities. So that's linking the practice to the pedagogy as well. So they said you need these 5 things in order to be contributing to sustainable translanguaging. And this all contributes to a goal of ensuring that translanguaging is contributing to the full multilingual repertoire in a positive way, while also protecting the minority language efforts. So my team and I read this, and we've talked with Jason and Dirk about this, and we said, yeah, actually, this is really good, and we think that this is good for a good starting place for connecting what's happening with translanguaging to what's going on with Indigenous communities. But we need to check to see if we're missing anything before proceeding with this. And so we asked, so how can sustainable translanguaging then be applied to Indigenous language teaching and learning contexts while remaining culturally responsive? Because that's real key, right? In Indigenous contexts is being culturally responsive and making sure you stay culturally responsive. So what's culturally responsive teaching? Culturally responsive pedagogies and practices, they look at instructional philosophy and practice critically, acknowledging and searching for the presence of historical forms of oppression embedded in curriculum, instruction, and approaches to teacher-student relationships. So that's like what I was talking about on the previous white paper written by the Indigenous scholars in the First Nations in Canada, where they were talking about, you know, this idea of correcting to a set standard. This is not originally an Indigenous concept. This is a settler colonial concept. So it's things like that. That would be a culturally responsive approach to pedagogy, is examining what we do. So we said, right, so this is really important, actually. So if we take sustainable translanguaging and we take cultural and community responsiveness as well, so also staying, what's the word? We maintain a responsibility towards the communities, right? So the communities, we constantly check in with them, and they can pull us up at any time. They can stop us at any time, adjust us at any time. That also aligns with what we call Mātauranga Māori, and not just Mātauranga Māori, but in general, a Māori approach to research and to working with any communities is that anytime you work with Indigenous communities, you should only be doing work that they want and only be doing work that helps them. And they have the final say in anything you do. So they guide what you do and what you don't do. And part of that is dismantling all of the global North takeover that has happened through settler colonial initiatives to Indigenous communities. So it's re-empowering Indigenous communities. And that's a big part of what we do, is we take the resources that we can access through the institutions like the university and like grant funding, and we make sure that we are working with the Indigenous communities in a way that is getting them what they need and empowering them with the settler colonial resources that we can harness, right? So this is a really important part of what we do. And so we've said, well, these things together, then if you take sustainable translanguaging, you take cultural and community responsiveness, that gives us what we've called socially responsive translanguaging, which this is kind of a long little blurb here, but basically we're talking about embracing individuals and communities' full linguistic repertoires in the process of meaning making that focuses on Indigenous sociolinguistic and sociocultural sustainability. It means designing translanguaging pedagogies that create a need and space for the Indigenous languages while simultaneously valuing all linguistic contributions made in this endeavor. Communities must be centered in the process, and historical and current forms of systemic oppression must be acknowledged and challenged. And that's really very, very important to also do something that is sustainable for the communities, that shows the communities that they're valued and that will live on in a productive way with the communities. So we say, okay, so we've got this now. So how can we apply our findings of spontaneous translanguaging to resources, including in the linguistic landscape? And how might these resources, including those in the linguistic landscape, support what we've now called a socially responsive translanguaging pedagogy? So now we get into the meat of the project, right? So we've utilized an ethnographic approach, working alongside and for the benefit of the communities. All of the data that we've collected, we do use emergent coding and in vivo recursively. So just for the data geeks out there who might want to know exactly what we do. And based on the trends in the data, we transcribe selections and translate them and then further discuss them across languages. So the reason we translate them is because we have a multilingual team with different levels of proficiency. So when our team meets up and discusses these, we have them translated into multiple languages so that people can move in and out of languages as they feel comfortable and bring additional insights into what they think might be going on. And we subject this to interactional sociolinguistic discourse analysis. And the reason we chose IS is because we take into account the full context of what we know, not just what was recorded, not just what's in the interaction, but what we've experienced as well. And we include linguistic landscape analysis as well. We also analyze this in light of culturally appropriate perspectives and values. So Mataranga Māori, which is Māori knowledge in its own right, Tikanga Māori, which are Māori practices and protocols, a variety of Samoan perspectives like Va, so respecting the relationship between people and space, also the relationship between all space and place and spiritual elements. Also, we look at things like socialization, translanguaging, the list goes on. All right, so this data that I'm going to talk about focuses really on Punareo in Aotearoa. Punareo is a language nest for children age 2 to 5 years old, and sometimes younger, sometimes down to 6 months, where the target languages set by the government are Te Reo Māori and English. However, this is different from, some people may be familiar with Kohanga Reo. Kohanga Reo is also a language nest in Aotearoa, but you are required to use at least 50% Te Reo Māori every day. And that can be audited to maintain government funding. However, Puna Reo is a bit more flexible. So they're just expected to have Te Reo Māori in English, but it's much more fluid. So again, we didn't want to do something that would make people feel threatened. So we chose to work with the Puna Reo. And the Aonga Mata, which is also a language nest for children. This is a Samoan one. So in New Zealand, Aonga Mata are expected to operate in Samoan, English, and Te Reo, all three, okay? And so we focused on children 2 to 5 years old. We didn't go younger than that because we wanted to look at their productive language usage, which gets a bit challenging when you go younger than that. And the majority of children at the Aonga Mata were new speakers to the community, so not heritage language speakers. They were coming in as speakers of a whole lot of other languages, but not Samoan. So they were picking that up there and adding it to their linguistic repertoire. While children at Puna Reo, the majority of them were heritage language speakers of Te Reo Māori. So our data collection, recorded data, was 8 weeks at the Puna Reo and 12 weeks at the Aonga Mata, twice per week. So we worked with these communities though for years, right? We're still with them, but this is the recorded data. 3 hours each time, 3 video cameras, 3 audio cameras. So in total, over 600 hours of recorded data. We're getting ready to go back in. So this number will increase significantly because we're not just working with 2 schools, now we're working with 5. All right, so yes, Josh, I agree. Yeah. All right, so this gives you a bit of an anonymous look at, anonymous to our children, of what the spaces more or less look like with the kids in them. So we put plasma filters over them. The Aonga Mata is on the left, the Puna Reo is on the right. So you see they're very active spaces where the floor space is used. There's lots happening all the time. This group of children on the left at the Aonga Mata was one of maybe 7 groups moving around the center at that point in time. And they just happened to choose that spot, and they were adorable. So I took their photo. Right. So like I mentioned, we wanted to see what was happening with translanguaging in everyday practice. So here's an example of what we saw. So on the left is the original as it occurred. On the right, I've translated it for you. But what I've done is everything that occurs in Te Reo Māori is bolded, so that even if you read the right in English, you can still see where movement is happening in languages. So we've got nā re te wā ki te kōrero I tū tāna ringa. It's ours turn to speak. So me wahanga tato, raining. Ai kei te ao, he aha atu, tū mai tō ringa re, and then wet. Ai tino pai tō whakatao, and then someone's name. Cold. Ai kei, please excuse my te reo. Ai kei te pupuhi te ho, kei te makariri, kei te ua hoki nei. So me he mea ka hare tato ki waha me aha, and then someone's name. Put your pote on your hu. Put your pote on or your hu. And I can't see the rest of this because the thing's blocking me. But, and now it's telling me I'm talking to myself. Kapai he ahu atu. All right. Got there. All right. So, and then you could see on the right, all the movement happening between languages. So that's just one short example of what we saw in the classroom. So what that allowed us to do was uncover 3 particular functions that we were seeing of translanguaging, 3 particular types. And we cross-referenced this with neurolinguistic research, there we go, for how these different types of multilingualism function. So we found in our data that there was translanguaging for self-repetition, which is when you repeat yourself, but you use a different language each time. And this was really common in the centers because they're children. This is something that happens in all centers with all children, is people repeat themselves. But what we were seeing was the movement between languages during this repetition. Also, continuous segmental translanguaging, so moving between languages intra-intentionally, and cross-speaker interactional translanguaging. So where someone speaks, a second speaker builds upon what that first person said, but do it in a different language from the first. So these are 3 types that we saw, and we checked it across all the data with both centers as well, and it was really quite important. So we said, okay, so we've got now what's happening in practice. We also want to see what's happening in the ecology of the centers looking at the linguistic landscapes, and with this more full view of linguistic landscape as well. So now for this, for the sake of time, I'm going to focus just on the Aonga Amata. Since I gave you the example from the Puna Reo, I want to show you something from the Aonga Amata now. And this image is what the Aonga Amata looks like. So it's a circular building. You walk in and you've got the office on the side, and then this is the hallway. You walk in, there's the bathrooms here. You come through here, then there's a kitchen, there's dining spaces. The babies are here, so under 2, they're on this side. There's a gardening area here, books here. This is the mat space you saw in the photo on the left, where they do lots of music activities every day. And this is play center area. Now, and that's free play. And then there's outside. So everywhere with the blue line is outside. Now, everywhere with the squiggles, that's all what I refer to in this research as multimodal translanguaging, right? So drawing on this idea of the more sensory linguistic landscapes, multimodal, and I'll go into that in just a second. But that's where all of this is going on. It's where things are on the wall that are interactive and multimodally as well. All right, so in the linguistic landscape, we see these three types of translanguaging throughout the entire linguistic landscape. So here's one example. You've got all the days of the week lining up on the board, and you've got asotofi in Samoan, taite in Tereo, and Thursday in English, right? And this is important because this ordering of languages also happens throughout the center, where you've got Samoan first because it's an Aonga Amata, so Samoan is put first, but Tereo is put second, the second indigenous language, right? Because Samoan's we classify it as an indigenous language as well, and it's one of the protected, supported languages of New Zealand because it is recognized for its indigenous status, but it's not the indigenous language of Aotearoa like Te Reo Māori is. So there's kind of a bit of language politics happening here, in that when I talked to the teachers and the center coordinators, they said they did put Te Reo second because they feel they're expected to, right? Because they also get evaluated by, by the government on how much Te Reo they use. So in the landscape, it is quite present, but also just, they said they felt it was important to put up as a marker of Indigenous language solidarity as well. So they do use it as well. They use English more in the classroom than they use Te Reo, but Te Reo takes the second spot in the linguistic landscape. So there is a presentation of the visual presentation of the importance assigned to languages that doesn't necessarily match practice, but is a message being sent to all the people coming through the landscape. Also, these newsletters are throughout the hallway when you enter, and you see here that there's a mix translanguaging between Samoan and English, and it translates roughly to this part here. When we finished the prayer, the flag was raised. The kids sang the anthem of Samoa. This child knows all the words. We all danced. The Samoan siva and haka. Okay, haka is Te Reo Māori word, so that's entered there as well. It's also quite important to New Zealand culture. Here we go. The children looked so beautiful. There are many children here at the Ongamata, and they come from different ethnic backgrounds, but they love Samoan culture, right? And then they go on to talking about the food. So we cooked special food, sapasui, and that's Samoan chop suey, right? And then they go on to talk about that. So there's this is just normal in the landscape, this translanguaging. So we said, cool. So what we were seeing in practice with the use of the types of translanguaging, not looking at named languages, but looking at the types of translanguaging that we saw in practice. We were seeing those types of translanguaging in the linguistic landscape as well. But we said, but there's heaps more going on. It's not just this traditional language use, textual use. We're seeing lots of multimodality as well, right? So not just text, but colors, shapes, perspectives, layouts, moods, visual, auditory, all this other stuff going on that makes the Scentscape. So how can we account for all of that multimodality as well? And we said, well, we're going to look specifically then also at multimodal translanguaging in the linguistic landscape, which can help us account for semiotic depictions of languages and cultures in the landscape. And we're interested in how people interact with the landscape. Because people are not passive observers. They don't just walk into a space and have no idea what's happening around them. People do interact with the space. They maybe don't see all of it, but they do see parts of it, and they have mental and emotional responses to semiotic elements of the linguistic landscape. And all of these, sorry, someone's mic is on. And all of these semiotic elements of the linguistic landscape are dialogic. So we're having these internal, often subconscious conversations with ourselves of what we've heard before, what we expect to hear, what we think people will respond, how we think people may have responded. So there are these dialogic intertextual conversations. These images, this multimodality, this Scentscape, it conveys a message and people respond to that message. So an example of this is some of the multimodal translanguaging taking place in the linguistic landscape, where this is traditional Samoan. It's a big tapestry that is up, marking it as a traditional Samoan space. These leis, they have a variety of leis from different Pacific Island nations in the center, marking them as a member of Pacifica identity, Pacific Island nations. And then I love this. These are jerseys of Wellington rugby teams. And, and that's really common to see also in New Zealand spaces. And it marks them not just as Samoan, but Samoan in New Zealand, in the Aotearoa, and what it means to merge the transnational with the local in this particular space. And then this is that mat time, but without the children, right? So I'm going to zoom in on some of what's here. So this square of the image, for instance, has so much happening in it. If we look at translanguaging through a multimodal perspective in the linguistic landscape. For instance, this is traditional Samoan print. This is traditional Maori print, right? And we've got these at the top here, marking right away the semiotic space as Indigenous, and then we have it all the way around the pictures at the top as well. Here, we've got a chant written out that's titled haka, which again is the Maori word for, if you've seen the All Blacks, for instance, the like war dance chant they do at the beginning, that's the haka. Okay, that's a haka. There are many haka. And so here they've written it as haka because it is this chant, but it's in Samoan, okay, until you get to this part that's Aotearoa, which is te reo again. So it's this combination. And then here you've also got a very popular song for children in New Zealand to teach them words in te reo. So ma is white, whero is red, kakariki green, pongo is black, mongo is two, a-e-i-o, right? So you've got that, and so that's English and te reo. Here, tenekoe, it's another little song for children, helping them know te reo again. So te reo in English. Here, Samoan Language Week, bringing some of the officiality to it, and this one is Samoan in English. And what's really interesting is this is one of only the official documents here. There's some of the only instances of Samoan in English without te reo present, right? So it's the more center made, you know, at the center, the text and also the images. There's lots of te reo Maori and just Maori in general, cultural and language presence alongside Samoan in English. It's more of the official government stuff, interestingly, that separates them out. All right. So we said this is really actually quite interesting looking at it multimodally, because we see that each resource individually conveys a particular linguistic or semiotic meaning, but you need to look at it together, because it's when you look at it together as a linguistic landscape bricolage that you start seeing this strong multimodal translanguaging presence start to come up. And this presence of strong multimodal translanguaging support in the linguistic landscape also shows support for multilingualism and multiculturalism. So I didn't have time to show you all the center, but they've got support for anytime the kids come in with different languages, they include those languages and cultural elements in the center as well. So there's a wall, for instance, that at the time of these photos had like 12 different languages and cultural elements on it, all right? So we also said, okay, again, staying with this idea of being socially responsive, and I'm wrapping up, sorry guys. Staying with this idea of being socially responsive, we need to contribute to the multimodal translanguaging that's going on in the linguistic landscape in a way that the centers would like. So this is one of the posters that we've created. They're huge, huge posters, A1 posters that are in the center, and they have translanguaging throughout, and they're multimodal. You can see the numbers and the letters present, and what you can't see is the lines there are little labels that the kids work with the teachers to affix to name the different stages of what's going on with the caterpillar. And why caterpillar? Well, it connects with the center's focus on nature, but also it connects with a Psalm 1 concept of regeneration and rebirth and new life as well. So this, again, is working with the center to include the cultural and linguistic elements that they want, that are helpful to them. We also created these books. So we've got one here that we've done for the Punareo. I don't really have time to go into it, but you can see all of the Tikanga Maori concepts that we've incorporated throughout the book, as well as doing it systematically with the underlying, we call it our translanguaging grammar, that is based on actual language usage and practice from the classrooms and then checked by the communities. And then here, this is the one for the Aonga Amata, and the focus here was on Va, so that spatial relationship. And we also made specific allowances each time for different ideas of what works and what doesn't for different communities to keep it socially responsive. And we've tested it with each of the communities and the languages to make sure, you know, it works for them, because different things work for different communities and different dialects, different experiences, different expectations. So basically, in order to enact this, we encourage people to use these resources by encouraging the use of the full linguistic repertoire, and we have some suggestions for how people can do that. There's this reading here if you'd like to hear more about the actual results of this, which we're all really supportive of, actually supporting the maintenance of Indigenous languages and that Indigenous language reclamation agenda as well. And that's for all kids, not just those of heritage language backgrounds, but all of the kids were picking up and using and making the languages come alive, right? Even those who were new speakers as well. They were carrying that with them outside of the classroom as well, into the home space. So if you're interested in reading more about the multimodal of this, I just put up a little chapter here that I just wrote on that came out, or is coming out next month. And our website for Translanguaging Aotearoa, there's heaps more information that I don't have time to go over, including how we recommend people do this stuff. And we put together a case study here, a book of international case studies from around the world of people talking about successful or challenging uses of translanguaging with different Indigenous languages in particular. We really focused on Indigenous languages around the world. And then some of the stuff I talked about is just there in case. I tried to make it easy to find if people wanted to use it. Just more stuff. So finally, final thoughts. The socially responsive translanguaging pedagogy, it can work in tandem with language reclamation efforts as long as it remains socially responsive. And translanguaging does offer this additional option. Like I said, we're not trying to replace immersion. We're trying to add extra resources to spaces that maybe are non-immersion or that have more new speakers, or also increasing the confidence of children who maybe are not as confident in immersion spaces. And this allows children to explore their more multilingual selves, and practice spontaneous translanguaging like they would in the wild, which is important for Indigenous languages in particular, but all minority languages. And by incorporating translanguaging into the linguistic landscape, that was reducing stigma associated with using translanguaging. So a lot of the worries that were there were reducing when more translanguaging was incorporated into the linguistic landscape. And the multimodal translanguaging, students, teachers, and parents really loved that because it made the acceptance of translanguaging appear more friendly and more accessible as well. And just in summary, it helps add to this translanguaging space, which, as Li Wei says, translanguaging space acts as a third space. It invigorates languages with new possibilities from a site of creativity and power. So it empowers all of those who are interacting with it. So whawhatai koutou for your wahu. And so that's me. And thanks to everyone and my whole list of thanks. And just a cheeky plug, this book just came out if you're interested in looking at beyond the classroom as well. My colleague Greg Neat and I just edited a volume on that just came out, like just did. So, all right, so that's me. I'll stop sharing.